Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to talk about the Dark Eldar Haemonculi and logistics. The best topic, because if you put aside all of the edgy emo nonsense, the flashcrafting, the tortures, the slicing and the dicing, then the real reason the homunculi have such an exalted position in Dark Eldar society is because they are invaluable logistical components to Commorragh. No, I'm not even joking. Most new Dark Eldar are born, created, more correctly, by the homunculi. The majority of a modern-day Kabals warriors are vat-grown tube babies, rather than the true-born sons and daughters of real Dark Eldars. Which makes sense. I mean, the Dark Eldar never struck me like the kind of people to create loving families. Plus, the whole thing that Eldar pregnancies are long, painful, and not very frequent either. Indeed, in Dark Eldar society, having a so-called true-born child is a sign of status. It shows that you have the ability to separate yourself from the rest of your duties for an extended period of time. You have the spare effort and resources to raise a child. Although I imagine Dark Eldar child rearing might be quite the thing. But we are wandering a little bit off topic already, are we not? So, the homunculi. Who and what are they, and why are they so important to the Dark Eldar, to the Kabals, to the point where the Kabals don't even dare mess with them, to the point that the homunculi covenants have become a power in and of themselves, standing not necessarily above, but certainly separate from and aside to the rest of Dark Eldar society? Well, the first question, who are they, is a little bit difficult to answer, because Commorraghian record keeping is shoddy at the best of times, and non-existent as far as the homunculi are concerned, who don't seem particularly concerned about keeping their own books pretty either. They have far more important things to do. But the prevailing theory is that they are, at the very least, amongst the very earliest inhabitants of Commorragh, which means that they were around during the fall of the Great Eldar Empire, which makes a lot of sense considering that they are universally ancient and withered creatures, to such an extent that even their unbelievable regenerative technology can no longer maintain their youthful appearance. And I want to point out here that their regenerative technology is to the point of bringing people back from the dead. So if your wrinkles are getting so bad that it is more difficult to cure them than death, yeah, that gives you an idea of their age. There are also suggestions that not merely were they around during the fall of the Eldar Empire, but they might have been the ones who actually instigated it, as the leaders of the various cults of pleasure that eventually corrupted Eldar society and brought about the birth of She Who Thirsts. I'm very partial to this theory myself, because it adds another layer of rot to the Dark Eldar. To think that the ones who brought about the fall of the old empire are still writhing around like the maggot at the heart of the apple in the new Eldar Empire of Commorragh. It's a cool idea. And again, it would give a reason for their exalted status, as when they arrived in Commorragh, they weren't just randos who wandered in like the rest of the refugees, they were already leaders of cults and organizations who would obviously create their own hierarchy, alongside and still separate to that of the old Dark Eldar nobility, which was overthrown by Asdrubal Vecht during his own little bloody revolution and the rise of the Kabals. Now, as for what services they provide, well, they are experts in the arts of torture and pain and flesh crafting, to the point that they are able to provide something that even the witches of the arena are not. To give you an idea here, as I mentioned several times previously when talking about the Dark Eldar, to them, pain and suffering is not merely a fun and engaging night on the town. It's not merely a festive family activity or something done for fun and entertainment. No, it is literally necessary for their continued existence. Without it, they will shrivel up and die, or at the very least enter into such a comatose state that they may as well be dead. It is fundamental nourishment to them, like food and water, or maybe even air might be a more apt comparison. But whereas there are various types of foods, there are various types of satisfying this urge. Torturing a humble Imperial guardsman to death by cutting him open on the battlefield, for example, might be bread, or depending upon how well you do it, how long it takes, might be bread with jam on it, to continue the tortured food metaphor. Whereas a high-class ticket to one of the premier witch arenas in Commorragh might be a 5-star dinner with a dessert. But the homunculi provide a service beyond even this. As the witches can maintain a Dark Eldar, it can even rejuvenate them, make them healthier and straight up younger. But what the homunculi can do is literal regeneration, to the point where there is a story of one homunculi being blown apart point blank range by a squad of Space Marine devastators armed with heavy bolters, to the point where his remnants needed to be gathered up with a soup ladle. And yet still, after being deposited into the rejuvenating sarcophaguses of the homunculi, he was up and about and walking again after a week. Granted, still somewhat reduced, but nevertheless, from extra chunky salsa to ambulatory in 7 days is quite the miracle. And unsurprisingly, this kind of service is in high demand amongst the Dark Eldar, who make a living out of constantly raiding real space, who are constantly having assassination attempts launched against them, brutal gang warfare or inter-Kabal strife, not to mention the open warfare that occasionally breaks out between them. The ability to return from the dead is quite nice, although it does come at excessive cost, limiting the service to only the uppermost strata of hoity-toity Dark Eldar nobility. And, of course, to the homunculi themselves. For whilst there are not actually all that many homunculi, they don't die very often. Not permanently, anyways. The homunculi organize themselves into so-called covenants. This is done as both a way to share resources and to make sure that even if they were to fall, there is always somebody around to, literally in their case, pick up the pieces and return them to an active state. Beyond the purely practical as well, the Covenants are also, fetish hangout groups, essentially, as those who tend to enjoy the same kind of extreme entertainment gather together. One would presume that, as it is mentioned that over the length of a homunculi's unending immortal life, their tastes tend to grow more extreme and specific. You will then have covenants within covenants, or perhaps you will have homunculi traveling from one covenant over to the other. Perhaps there are even recruitments between them, though they strike me as more as voluntary associations rather than competing organizations, like, for example, the Kabals. In fact, that is an interesting distinction to make. The Kabals overthrew the old decadent Dark Eldar nobility precisely because they had grown decadent and stale. They were no longer sharp, they were no longer dangerous. The only thing that provided them protection was, well, their status, their money, their ability to buy bodyguards, and this was not enough to protect them from the Kabals. But the Kabals in turn are also painfully aware that if they do not continuously remain strong, sharp, dangerous and powerful, they too will be immediately torn down by the other 24 Kabals rising up from below them, desperate for their turn in the sun. The homunculi, on the other hand, are separate from this, because again, well, they provide services that the Kabals require. The ability to bring back their leaders from death, the ability to bring back favored warriors, a particularly excellent bodyguard, for example, or a favored witch, as a sign of favor, or even as a way of purchasing their allegiance and or loyalty. The witches' cult in turn too have need of the homunculi services, both for the obvious resurrection things and for the providing of particularly delectable pieces of entertainment, of architectural delights, living tapestries of flesh and blood, and particularly exquisite tortures. The top-of-the-line gourmet food, one might compare it to, of the Dark Eldar realm. And in addition to these practical concerns, there is also the fact that the Covenants are significant military forces in their own right as well, employing hordes of racks and grotesques. These abominable fleshcraft creations of the homunculi are both their servants, their aides, and their stormtroopers. They provide the homunculi with all of the various services they require. They take care of their prisoners, they feed the stock, they rile them up when required, they keep them in line, they maintain their palaces, and they also fight their wars. Something in which they excel, incidentally, as each and every one of them is crafted to carry out their specific purpose, with a few artistic flourishes here and there, of course, as no two racks or grotesques are ever truly alike. There are always going to be little touches here and there, an extra limb, slightly different curvatures of the hooked arm blades or the fingers, slightly different face mask or tattoo patterns, or different sorts of chemical injections to keep them riled up, shall we say. This makes them absolutely lethal close-quarters combatants, and combined with the fact that they can be unloaded in ridiculous numbers on the enemy, makes them very, very dangerous. And no Cabal would want to piss off the homunculi unnecessarily. There might be reasons to make an enemy of a Covenant, at least temporarily should they prove weak, but well, the thing is, even if you manage to defeat the Covenant in its total, if even a globulate of their gore survives to be recovered by a different Covenant, well, now you have an immortal, extraordinarily patient and dangerous enemy more than willing to wait a century or more to carry out their vengeance. In fact, there are stories of them doing just this, one case including the Raven Guard. The homunculi abducted a company of Raven Guard, and then allowed the Raven Guard to rescue them once again. Without the Raven Guard's knowledge, the homunculi had subtly disfigured and corrupted their gene seed, so that the next generation of Raven Guard, several hundred of them, all suddenly, all at once, due to some brilliantly interred form of genetic coding, turned into monsters and began attacking their comrades instinctively. The Raven Guard ended up having to kill several hundred of their new neophytes and even early battle brothers due to this. Again, the homunculi are very, very patient, and they take a great deal of diligence in their art. My favorite example, I believe I've mentioned this once previously, but there was an Imperial Hive world that was visited by one of their carnivals, a festive name for a homunculi war host. 5 years later, the Imperium sent an expedition to the world because, well, they were wondering where their taxes were. And when they arrived, they found a hive perfectly intact without so much as a fleck of blood or a single scorch mark anywhere in the hive. That was unnerving. And imagine, because a hive world, even the Dark Eldar cannot attack and take a hive without a bit of violence, obviously. But that means that they took it, they killed everyone or carted them off as slaves, they brutally eviscerated the garrison, slaughtered its leaders or tortured them, and then they cleaned the place up. Perfectly, to the point where not even a speck of blood remains. They crime scene cleaned the entire hive city from top to bottom. It must have taken months, years maybe, and all of this for no other reason than to freak the fuck out of the guys who'd come investigate it 5 years later. Oh, that is dedication right there. And again, why you would not want to make an enemy out of the homunculi. For their part, the various covens tend to remain near perfectly neutral when it comes to the day-to-day businesses of Comarog. They'll take occasional minor preferences inside here and there if they have an agenda, but by and large they will provide their services to anyone for any reason, though again at a price, of course. Not just rejuvenation and regeneration technology, but also the creation of fresh warriors. As I mentioned a little bit earlier on, the homunculi is the source of many of the Kabals' fighters, as the actual birth and raising of a Dark Eldar is a very, 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 very slow and long-term effort, usually done as a prestige project, if at all. Whereas the homunculi can take a fertilized egg and via an ingenious system of rapid growth VATs create a fully grown and matured warrior in a fraction of the time. These kinds of services, however, are usually carried out in exchange for real compensation. See, one of the interesting things about Dark Eldar society is that they have a lot of different forms of currency. In reality, the currency is whatever the opposition wants out of the transaction, and whatever you are receiving is the currency that you want. It's closer to a bartering system, really, than our current day idea of an economy. And in the case of the homunculi, well, some things will obviously always have value. Certain alchemical ingredients that are rare or difficult to come by, for example. Extraordinarily rare plants or poisons, mayhaps. Or chosen body parts from slain foes, or particular organs from great foes, like gene seed is an obvious example, or maybe the acid organs from tyranids, etc. The more difficult it is to get, the more value it undoubtedly holds. In other cases, it might also be the specific preference of the homunculi in question. As we mentioned earlier on again, homunculi tend to develop more extreme tastes over the course of their immortal lives. They grow ever more picky in their habits. Some might, for example, only feed on spleens of female humans between the ages of 25 and 27. Nothing else. That's the only thing he'll eat. Which means that to him, a steady supply of this is very valuable, because it's his literal food. Whereas another might not eat at all, but dine only on the suffering of other Eldar, for example. Maybe he has a particular taste for proper Eldar, his non-fallen cousins, yet others again might actually prefer the slightly acrid tinge of Dark Eldar souls. Another obvious form of currency would be slaves. And this is probably the most common one, because, well, creating stuffs like the wretches and the grotesques, not to mention all of the various experiments that the homunculi carry out continuously to further push the limits of their flashcrafting arts, requires a great deal of raw resources, of varying types as well. Humans, orcs, Eldar, Tyranids, whatever is out there, some homunculi will have some designs for them, and usually, again, they will require quantity, although occasionally quality is the required resource as well. Perhaps a specific experiment can only be carried out on a space marine, or only an orc, or only a Tyranid, etc. In these cases, a homunculi might be offering up sponsorship, or a coven more likely, to a cabal in return for a real space raid against a desired target, a specific hive world, for example. Alternatively, the covens themselves might also organize their own little real space outings, their carnivals. In these cases, though, they are not necessarily doing so for profit in and of itself. Their exalted position within Comorogian society means that if they ever needed anything, odds are there are plenty of Cabal lords and ladies out there willing to give it up to them in return for their services. But if they've got a personal agenda, for example, the creation of what they would view as a piece of art, maybe, then, of course, using the Cabals as a form of payment is an option, but can you trust rough, crude Kabalite warriors to fully understand the grand vision of a master fleshcrafter? Can they figure out exactly why it is very important that the bodies be placed in exactly just such shapes to create a larger, more glorious impression? After all, if you're building a half-living scarecrow out of the flayed corpses of Imperial citizens, the devil really is in the detail. And considering the homunculi do this for their own entertainment and pleasure as much as they do for the covens as well, they undoubtedly have some sort of internal hierarchy. However unofficial it is, there is a degree of superiority of position dependent upon age and creation, and as such, undoubtedly there are competitions within the covens as well to create the most majestically disgusting works. And as with all artists, there are differing levels of skill and ambition on display as well. Perhaps one of the more famous homunculi is Urian Rakarth, a very famous individual in the Dark Eldar world. He announced that he was going to put on a special show using his Carnival of Pain during the mourning period for Asdrubal Vecht, who died, temporarily, during that whole Ivrain thing and the Gathering Storm bullshit that surrounded it. As you might imagine, the death of the supreme leader of Comorog drew quite a crowd. Everyone who was anyone in Comorogian society attended the funeral, just like Urian had anticipated. And during the height of the celebration/mourning, he turned his creations upon the attendants, who were universally, to the last man and woman, torn to pieces and half devoured by his monsters. But that wasn't the true artistry. No. Anyone can kill. What was far more impressive was that he managed to use the pain, the anguish, the betrayal, the blood of the attendants to resurrect Asdrubal Vecht. Not through the usual lengthy process of rebirth that can take weeks and weeks, but instead over the course of mere minutes and hours, returning him not just to full strength, but better than before. And as a final flex, just to really drive home the point, Urian then turned around and resurrected the guests as well, somehow managing to take the presumably finite energies released by their death and not just resurrecting the chosen target, Vect, but all of them too. Now, not all of them in the same state, of course. Urian had done this specifically to ensure that he had the patronage of Vect for all eternity, the unquestioning patronage. And so he allowed the Great Master of Commorragh to determine who would be brought back in full and who would be, more living corpse than truly alive. An everlasting reminder of the cost of going up against Asdrubal Vect. Not the only punishment Asdrubal had Urian work out for him either, mind you. In one particularly fiendish and insulting punishment, Vect had Urian figure out a way to turn Dark Eldar into humans. Perfect replicas of human beings that moved like humans, that talked like humans, even that smelled like humans. Now you might be wondering what's so bad about that. Well, to the Eldar, we are particularly disgusting creatures because they see something of themselves in us, and yet they are devoid of all of their grace, all of their fine features, their extraordinary nature. It is like if we were to look at a particularly retarded monkey and be told, hey, that's you. It'd be insulting, wouldn't it? This punishment was created specifically to punish those of the Dark Eldar who were beginning to fall to the Ynnari faith. The Eldar goddess of the dead, Ynyad, which was created during, again, that whole storm of blah 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 dumbass nonsense. Actually, I don't hate the Eldar part of it anyway near as much as I dislike the Imperial part of it. Now, it does have a bit of a stink of the end times over it, because suddenly the regular Eldar and the Dark Eldar have something in common, like how the Wood Elves, the Dark Elves, and the High Elves of Warhammer were suddenly all friends and buddy-buddy again. You know, despite the hundreds of years, if not thousands, of continuous, vicious hatred that they share for one another. But hey, you know, they figured out the Witch King was really their actual boss by divine right, and so obviously they'd all just accept that, right? Much like the Dark Angels will just accept Primaris Marines, because it's not like they've got any secrets or anything. The current level of 40k writing hurts me. Anywho, these new Dark Eldar turned humans were even used to infiltrate human society in an effort to try and track down the faithful and assassinate them wherever possible. And punishment, of course, is another valuable commodity that the homunculi offer up to the rest of the Dark Eldar. As I'm sure you've figured out by now, they tend to be rather, asshole-ish people. Exceptionally so, in fact. And when they make an enemy out of someone, they don't just want to kill them, that's far too easy. They need to be displayed in full public as a screaming flag or something. Or be turned into a particularly disturbing set of furniture, or a walking meatball blob to waffle through the streets, randomly attacking and killing civilians. You know, stuff to that general extent. Problem is, it's kind of hard. The mortal body is usually only able to sustain so much before it kind of just dies, obviously. The homunculi's ability to make sure that the body doesn't die, no matter how much punishment and horror they heap upon it, is probably as valuable a skill to the Dark Eldar as rejuvenation is. These varying services also mean that there is some competition between the various covens as well. For as much as the homunculi like to think themselves above Dark Eldar society at large, the truth is that even in their extraordinarily exalted position, there's only ever so many resources to go around, and with the ever-increasing ambition and madness of the average homunculi requiring more and more and more, they do tend to want to build reputations as specialists in certain fields. For example, the Hex Coven are considered to be the best flesh crafters. If you need something truly imaginative created, they're the ones you go to. For example, if you want your favorite enemy turned into a goldfish that will live for the rest of its eternal life in a tank filled with nothing but the vicious, slimy, half-fluid excrement of your enemies. Whilst, of course, the fish can never be allowed to die, and the person that you've turned into the goldfish must also be able to always be perfectly aware of his suffering as well. A tall order, mayhaps, but the hexers will undoubtedly be able to figure out some way to make it work out. Alternatively, if you need something more subtle, like a poison or a plague, the Altered are the coven of most people's choice, as they will create not only just toxins that create excruciating suffering for choice victims, but even specifically coded poisons that can be released into the atmosphere of entire planets that will only kill those in a particular grouping. As I mentioned previously, with certain homunculi figuring out that they have very unique proclivities, they might be looking for slaves of only very certain types, and finding all of them individually can be a real bother. Alright, well, just aerosolize the entire planet with a form of genetic marker that grows over the course of years, identifying every single left-handed person, for example. So that when the Dark Eldar launch a real space raid a decade later, they can simply just open up their little fancy Dark Eldar iPad and find the location of every single person with the genome that they are looking for. Of course, there are also far more direct ways of using toxins and plagues, etc. You could kill off an entire population, or preferably merely weaken them enough to the point where they'll still be good sport, but they won't actually provide any actual threat to the invaders. After all, if they're all dead when the Dark Eldar show up, well, that'll just be a damned bummer now, won't it? Plus, poison is a subtle weapon and can be used against non-outside enemies as well, with relatively little chance of discovery. The Dark Eldar are, as always, as fond of killing one another as they are of dealing with the lowly creatures of the outside world. And if an homunculus coven can be on your side instead of the enemies, well, all the better. Even more so, if it offers the opportunity for the acquisition of truly choice specimens for the homunculi. As again, since they are ever pursuing the perfection of their craft, well, Dark Eldar specimens are perhaps as highly prized as anything else. After all, if you are a member of, say, the Nemesis Covenant, for example, who seeks the most perfect way of killing every single living thing in existence, not necessarily eradicating them, just the objectively best way to kill a member of a certain species, well, you gotta figure out a way to kill Dark Eldar lordlings as well, surely. Including even demons. See, there is a fair amount of actual experimentation within the homunculi orders, and the covenants more correctly, where, despite them having been alive for a very long time, they still do not know everything, and occasionally their hubris causes a little bit of a screw-up or two either. There was on one occasion, for example, that they bound the soul of a greater demon to a Dark Eldar lordling. And, well, they didn't know that until the Dark Eldar ordered the homunculi torn to pieces and eaten. Well, you know. Sometimes in experimentations you've got to die once or twice before you get it right, but nevertheless, can't make an omelette without breaking a few homunculi eggs. I believe it was in connection with that resurrection too that, well, here's the problem. There are certain limits to the resurrectionist arts. If a corpse has been reduced too greatly, it's going to be very difficult to bring them back, no matter how much As hurt, you pour into their recovery coffins. Furthermore, if the body has simply disappeared, being blasted into atoms, or you just don't know where it is, again, that poses a considerable challenge to the homunculus arts. So many of them have been researching for quite some time to figure out a way to bring the actual soul back as well, rather than merely rebuilding the body. And there have been some successful experiments, usually involving their more straight-laced cousins. In this particular experiment, I believe it was a farseer or something that was sacrificed over a period of a very long time, and his death screams were used to entice the soul in question. Once the soul had been brought into their grasp, the homunculi managed to capture it and reconstitute the body from the soul itself. Don't ask me how that works, particularly considering the fact that, well, souls are a valuable resource in the immaterium, and even if a body goes dead inside of Komarog, you'd think it would slip out somehow, but apparently this suggests that anyone who dies in Komarog will forever be trapped in Komarog. On the one hand, reassuring note, considering what awaits any Eldar that dies in the 41st millennium, and yet at the same time, maybe being eaten by Slaanesh might actually be a preferable fate. That's a philosophical debate for the ages right there. Yet, it is still a pressing field of research for the homunculi, because whilst they are functionally immortal, even if killed in the midst of battle, again, if the body is so reduced it is literally unrecoverable, even a homunculi may die. And, considering their somewhat obsessive nature, and their view of themselves as dark gods ruling above lesser beings, death is something that they would rather like to avoid. It is something they would wish to conquer as quickly as possible, but even their dark arts presumably has some limitations, even if they might disagree with that evaluation. And unfortunately for the rest of the 41st millennium, by and large, the homunculi are still correct when they proclaim themselves immortals, as even over the preceding thousands of years, their numbers do not appear to have diminished noticeably, as they continue to spread fear and terror throughout the galaxy. And on that happy little note, I will wrap this one up. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.